On the morning of November 29th, 1943, at precisely 11:32, a young Wisconsin farm boy named Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran crouched in the rear compartment of a B-17 flying fortress called Ricky Tikitavi, his eyes fixed on a swarm of German fighters approaching his aircraft like a furious cloud of wasps. This 19-year-old was experiencing his very first combat operation over a heavily fortified enemy target. That morning, the 8th Air Force had dispatched more than 300 heavy bombers with orders to obliterate Bremen's industrial facilities. During just the first 60 minutes of the raid, German air defenses had already managed to bring down 6 flying fortresses. Moran occupied what was arguably the most isolated position aboard the entire aircraft. The tail gunner's station placed him on a bicycle-style seat at the extreme rear of the bomber, with 40 feet of fuselage creating a barrier between him and his fellow crew members. His sole companions were a pair of .50 caliber machine guns and the enemy pilots determined to end his life. The B-17 had a crew complement of 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot occupied the cockpit, while the navigator and bombardier worked in the nose section. The flight engineer manned the top turret. The radio operator positioned himself behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side. The ball turret gunner hung suspended beneath the aircraft in a transparent spherical compartment, and Moran sat completely alone in the tail. The tail gunner's mission was straightforward: defend the bomber's most exposed approach angle. Early in the conflict, German fighter pilots had discovered that attacking a B-17 from directly astern placed them within the firing range of only a single defender, the tail gunner. By this point, in November 1943, the 8th Air Force was experiencing devastating bomber losses. The raid on Schweinfurt just 2 months prior had resulted in the destruction of 60 flying fortresses in a single day's operations. That one afternoon saw 600 airmen either killed in action or taken prisoner. Bomber crews had developed their own grim nickname for deep penetration missions into German airspace, calling them _0__. The mathematics governing their chances of survival were absolutely brutal. To complete their tour of duty and return home, a bomber crew needed to fly 25 missions. However, statistical analysis revealed that the average crew only survived 15 missions. Certain bomb groups were losing half their aircraft strength every single month. Moran had signed his enlistment papers the very day he turned 18. He'd grown up working on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, where he would watch aircraft pass overhead and fantasize about becoming a flyer himself. The Army Air Forces had an urgent need for gunners, specifically young men who possessed quick reflexes and steady nerves, farm boys who already understood how to handle firearms. His gunnery training taught him the skills needed to track rapidly moving targets while accounting for wind conditions, altitude, and his own aircraft's velocity. He learned the proper technique of firing in controlled bursts to prevent his gun barrels from becoming dangerously overheated. He committed to memory the distinctive silhouettes of German fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. He could positively identify them at a distance of 2,000 yards. However, no amount of training could truly prepare anyone for the harsh reality of aerial combat over Germany. At an altitude of 24,000 feet, temperatures would plummet to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite would claim the fingers and toes of unwary airmen. The oxygen-depleted air made even simple movements utterly exhausting, and the German fighters would attack in successive waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons capable of shredding aluminum skin like tissue paper. That morning, Ricky Tikitavi had lifted off from Snetterton Heath in England as part of the 96th Bomb Group. Their assigned target was Bremen, a major industrial city located on the Weser River. The city housed shipyards, aircraft manufacturing plants, and submarine pens, making it one of the most heavily defended urban centers throughout Germany. The bomber formations had crossed the North Sea while maintaining tight defensive box formations, with each B-17 carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. The tactical theory was elegantly simple. Pack the bombers into close proximity so their combined firepower could repel attacking enemy fighters. The practical reality was that a direct hit on one aircraft would often inflict damage on those flying in a close formation beside it. As the formations neared their target, Bremen's anti-aircraft defenses opened up with everything they had. Black clouds of flak explosions filled the entire sky. The bombers couldn't take evasive action during their bombing run. They had to maintain straight and level flight. Shrapnel fragments tore through wings and fuselages with terrifying efficiency. Through his position in the tail, Moran witnessed a B-17 in the formation ahead take a direct hit. The aircraft literally folded in half before dropping out of the sky. Ricky Tikitavi successfully released its bomb load over the primary target, 4,000 pounds of high explosive ordnance tumbling toward the factories far below. The mission objective had been accomplished. Now, all that remained was surviving the long flight back to England. If you're interested in discovering how Moran's mission ultimately concluded, please hit that like button. Your likes help us share more overlooked historical accounts like this one with a wider audience. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Now, back to Moran's story. The bomber formation initiated its turn toward England, with 200 miles of hostile airspace separating them from safety. That's precisely when Ricky Tikitavi's No. 2 engine took a direct flak hit. The propeller began windmilling uselessly in the airstream. The aircraft started bleeding speed almost immediately. A damaged bomber falling behind its formation was essentially a death sentence. German fighter pilots actively watched for stragglers, knowing that a lone B-17 without the protective umbrella of mass defensive fire made easy prey. Moran spotted them approaching, about a dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, while another group of Focke-Wulfs dove from above. Ricky Tikitavi was about to engage in a desperate fight against overwhelming odds, completely alone, and positioned in the tail gunner station, Eugene Moran would become their primary target. The first Messerschmitt approached from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and beneath the bomber's tail. Moran pressed his shoulders firmly against the steel armor plate behind him and squeezed his triggers hard. His twin .50 caliber machine guns erupted to life with a deafening roar. Tracer rounds streaked toward the attacking fighter. The German pilot immediately broke off his attack run and rolled away to safety. But there were more enemy fighters coming, many more. The Focke-Wulfs employed classic pair tactics. One fighter would draw the gunner's attention and fire, while its wingman maneuvered into position for a killing shot. Moran swung his guns rapidly from target to target, tracking each threat. Spent brass casings accumulated around his knees in growing piles. The acrid smell of burnt cordite filled his cramped compartment completely. At their current altitude of 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Ricky Tikitavi had dropped to 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit for protection, but the bitter cold still managed to seep through the insulation. His exhaled breath formed tiny ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew increasingly hot from continuous firing, while simultaneously his fingers went progressively numb inside his insulated gloves. The German pilots were seasoned professionals and Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since the war's beginning in 1939. They understood exactly how to methodically destroy a B-17 flying fortress. Their standard procedure was to target the engines first, since a bomber with damaged engines couldn't maintain formation speed. Then they would systematically work on eliminating the gunners to reduce defensive fire. Finally, they would pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital was destroyed. Moran heard the impacts a split second before he actually felt them. 20-millimeter cannon shells punching through the aluminum skin with a sound like tearing metal. Somewhere in the forward section, one of the waist gunners suddenly stopped firing, followed shortly by the other. The intercom system filled with static and fragmented voices that Moran couldn't understand. He couldn't determine who was speaking or what they were trying to communicate. The bomber shuddered violently as additional rounds found their mark. He just kept firing his guns because there was literally nothing else he could do in that moment. A Focke-Wulf came screaming in from the 4 o'clock position at high speed. Moran swung his guns to track it and pressed his triggers without hesitation. The fighter's wing suddenly disintegrated under the concentrated fire. It began spiraling downward, trailing a thick stream of black smoke. His first confirmed kill of the war. He didn't have even a second to celebrate this achievement. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section with devastating effect. Moran felt something slam hard into his left forearm, then immediately into his right. Both of his arms had been hit by enemy fire. Blood began soaking through the sleeves of his flight suit at an alarming rate. The pain was both immediate and intensely sharp, but remarkably, his hands still functioned. He could still maintain his grip on the triggers and keep fighting. More impacts struck the aircraft in rapid succession. The vertical stabilizer mounted above him absorbed multiple direct hits. Control cables suddenly snapped and began whipping violently through the air around him. The entire tail section started vibrating so violently he could feel it in his bones. Something was very seriously wrong with the aircraft's structural integrity. Moran glanced down at his chest-mounted parachute with growing concern. Every airman wore one as standard equipment. The silk canopy was packed into a canvas container strapped securely to his chest. If the bomber went down and he had to bail out, that parachute represented his only realistic chance of surviving. Then he saw the holes torn through the fabric, multiple holes riddling the entire pack. Enemy cannon rounds had completely shredded his parachute, rendering it useless. If he had to bail out now, he would plummet 4 miles to certain death on the ground below. The relentless attack continued without pause. German fighters made repeated pass after pass at the crippled bomber. Moran counted at least 15 enemy aircraft circling the damaged B-17 like predators. Ricky Tikitavi was steadily bleeding both altitude and airspeed. The remaining functional engines strained desperately to keep the massive aircraft airborne. Forward in the nose section, Navigator Jesse Orison was still alive and fighting. He had sustained wounds, but remained conscious and at his station. However, the pilot and co-pilot were both dead at their controls. The flight engineer was dead in his turret position. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. Both waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from England together that morning, only 2 were still drawing breath. Orison, positioned in the nose, and Moran, isolated in the tail, with 40 feet of shattered, bullet-riddled fuselage separating them. Another cannon round struck the bomber, and this particular hit found something absolutely critical. Moran felt the entire aircraft lurch violently beneath him. A terrible grinding sound echoed through the damaged airframe structure. The vibration intensified dramatically until his teeth were literally rattling in his skull. Then came a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The ear-splitting shriek of tearing aluminum accompanied by the scream of catastrophic structural failure. Ricky Tikitavi was literally breaking apart in midair. The fuselage split completely just forward of the tail section where Moran sat. He watched in horror as the front portion of the aircraft separated and began falling away from him. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, and the bodies of his dead crewmates, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. He was completely alone now, trapped inside a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed and useless, 24,000 feet above enemy territory and falling toward the earth. The fundamental laws of physics offered absolutely no mercy in this situation. Terminal velocity for an unprotected human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. However, the tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds, meaning it would fall significantly faster, much faster than a human body. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds remaining to live. The severed tail section tumbled chaotically through the sky, spinning end over end and throwing Moran violently against the walls of his confined compartment. His wounded arm screamed with unbearable pain. Blood sprayed across every interior surface. The wind howled ferociously through the torn opening where the rest of the aircraft had previously been attached. By any rational measure, Moran should have been completely paralyzed with overwhelming fear. He should have simply curled into a ball and passively waited for death to claim him. Instead, he did something that completely defied all logic and reason. He kept fighting back. The German fighters were still circling overhead, observing the scene. They spotted the tail section falling and moved in closer for a better look. Perhaps they wanted to confirm their kill for certain. Perhaps they were merely curious about the unusual sight. Whatever their actual reason for approaching, they made a fatal tactical mistake. They flew within effective range of a severely wounded tail gunner who absolutely refused to die quietly. Moran grabbed hold of his machine guns once again. The wildly spinning tail section made any kind of accurate aiming nearly impossible. The intense G-forces pressed him hard against his seat one moment, then threw him violently toward the ceiling the next. His arms were actively bleeding from their wounds. His parachute had been destroyed beyond any use. He was falling 4 miles toward absolutely certain death, and yet he was still actively shooting at the enemy. Tracer rounds arced wildly and erratically through the sky as the tail section continued its chaotic rotation. The German pilots immediately scattered in all directions, caught completely off guard. They had never witnessed anything remotely like this before in their combat experience. A man trapped in a falling coffin of twisted metal, firing back at them with absolutely everything he had left. One unfortunate Messerschmitt took multiple hits across its fuselage from Moran's defensive fire. The pilot immediately broke off his approach and dove hard toward the ground below, trailing thick smoke from his damaged aircraft. The altimeter mounted in the tail section had been shattered and rendered useless, but Moran could clearly see the ground growing rapidly larger through the torn gaps in the twisted metal surrounding him. Fields, forests, roads, a patchwork quilt of German farmland was rushing up to meet him at terminal velocity. Ironically, the tail section's basic aerodynamics ended up saving his life in those critical moments. The large vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers functioned somewhat like crude, improvised wings. In the airstream, they caught the rushing air and generated significant drag force. Instead of plummeting straight down like a stone, the wreckage actually began to glide through the air in a somewhat controlled manner, almost controlled anyway. Moran quickly estimated he was falling at approximately 100 feet per second, still fast enough to kill him instantly on impact, but notably slower than a human body in pure free fall without any drag. The stabilizer surfaces were essentially buying him precious time, mere seconds, perhaps as much as a minute. He used that borrowed time to continue firing at any German fighter that dared to come within close range. The ground measured 5,000 feet below his position, then rapidly closed to 3,000 feet, then suddenly, just 1,000 feet separated him from impact. Moran braced himself as firmly as possible against the steel chest plate armor. He wrapped his severely wounded arms around the heavy ammunition boxes, since there was literally nothing else available to hold on to for the coming impact. The falling tail section struck the top of a tall pine tree at approximately 100 miles per hour. The violent impact instantly snapped branches as thick as a grown man's arm like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer caught hard on a massive trunk and was completely torn away from the wreckage. The remains of the tail section cartwheeled violently through the dense forest canopy, shedding pieces of crumpled aluminum with each successive impact against the trees. Moran's head slammed brutally into the steel framework mounted above his position. His vision exploded into blinding white light that consumed everything. He felt several of his ribs crack audibly. Both of his arms bent at angles they were absolutely never designed to bend naturally. The battered tail section collided with yet another massive tree, spun sideways with tremendous force, and finally crashed into the frozen ground below with a thunderous impact. Then, suddenly, there was complete silence. Against all possible odds, Eugene Moran was still alive. Barely. He lay motionless in the twisted wreckage, completely unable to move even slightly. Both of his forearms had sustained breaks in multiple places, compound fractures with white bone actually protruding through torn skin. His ribs were thoroughly shattered throughout his chest. Every single breath he attempted brought waves of stabbing pain. Blood poured freely from a severe wound on his head where a jagged piece of his skull had been completely torn away. His brain tissue was partially exposed to the freezing air, completely unprotected. The crash site was located in a forest near the German town of Syke, approximately 15 miles south of Bremen, deep in enemy-controlled territory. Moran found himself surrounded by civilians and soldiers who had just watched American bombers destroy their factories and kill their neighbors. He attempted to move his body, and his legs responded with weak, limited movement. His arms were completely useless, hanging limp at his sides. The bitter cold was already beginning to seep deep into his broken body. Without immediate medical intervention, hypothermia would kill him within just a few hours, assuming his catastrophic wounds didn't claim his life first. Using whatever strength remained, Moran crawled slowly and painfully toward the torn opening where the tail section had separated from the main aircraft. Each tiny movement sent fresh waves of pure agony radiating through his shattered body. He managed to pull himself out onto the frozen ground and looked up at the gray, overcast German sky above. He had just survived a 4-mile fall without any functional parachute, an achievement that only 3 men in the entire war would ever accomplish. But simply surviving the fall meant absolutely nothing if he bled to death alone in a frozen German forest. The sound of voices echoed through the trees around him, German voices speaking rapidly. Soldiers were approaching to investigate the crash site they'd witnessed. They would soon discover an American airman suffering from catastrophic, life-threatening injuries, an enemy combatant, one who had just participated in bombing their city. What they would choose to do with him remained entirely uncertain. The German soldiers emerged cautiously from the tree line with their rifles raised and ready to fire. They quickly surrounded the smoking wreckage and stared down at the American lying broken in the snow before them. One soldier barked orders sharply to the others. Another immediately ran back toward the road, presumably to summon an officer to the scene. Moran was in no condition whatsoever to resist their capture. He couldn't fight back, even if he wanted to. He could barely manage to breathe through the pain. The soldiers searched him roughly and without any care, completely ignoring his agonized screams as they moved his shattered arms during their search. They located his dog tags, examined his rank insignia, and inspected his completely ruined parachute with interest. They left him lying motionless on the frozen ground while they thoroughly examined the crashed tail section. A German officer arrived at the scene within the hour. He took one look at Moran's extensive wounds and shook his head slowly, clearly believing the American was dying. Transporting him anywhere at all seemed utterly pointless given his condition, but military orders were very specific. Downed airmen were to be captured alive and interrogated if at all possible. Dead airmen couldn't provide any useful intelligence information. They loaded Moran's broken body onto a rough wooden cart without any stretcher, blankets, or medical attention whatsoever. The primitive cart bounced and jolted along frozen, rutted roads for what felt like endless hours to Moran. Every single bump and jolt sent fresh waves of agony through his broken ribs and fractured arms. The gaping wound on his skull had finally stopped bleeding, but only because the extreme cold had frozen the blood into a dark, crusty scab. The cart eventually delivered him to some kind of German military facility, though Moran couldn't identify exactly what type. His vision kept blurring in and out of focus. His consciousness came and went in unpredictable waves throughout the journey. He retained fragmented memories of being roughly carried inside the building. He remembered lying for hours on a bare concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him clinically as if he were already a corpse. No doctor came to examine him. No medic offered any treatment. Not a single person offered him water, bandages, or morphine for his excruciating pain. The Germans had severely limited medical supplies available, and they certainly weren't about to waste precious resources on an enemy airman who would probably die very soon anyway. Moran lay motionless on that cold concrete floor for 2 full days. His wounds became progressively infected as bacteria multiplied. The exposed brain tissue began to swell dangerously. His broken arms turned disturbing shades of purple and black as circulation failed. Gangrene was actively setting in throughout the damaged tissue. Without immediate surgery, he would inevitably lose both limbs to amputation. Without antibiotics to fight the infection, the bacteria would spread to his bloodstream and cause sepsis. Without any medical intervention at all, he had perhaps 48 hours left to live at most. The German guards assigned to watch him observed his steady deterioration with varying reactions. Some appeared completely indifferent to his suffering. Others seemed almost sympathetic to his desperate plight. But none of them possessed either the authority or the available resources necessary to save his life. American bombers had been systematically destroying German cities for many months now, creating severe shortages. Medical supplies had become extremely scarce throughout Germany. Doctors were completely overwhelmed, treating the flood of German casualties from bombing raids. Enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and German civilians on every medical priority list. On the 3rd day of his captivity, Moran was transported once again, loaded onto another rough cart for another agonizing journey over frozen roads. This time, his destination was a prisoner of war hospital facility, a hastily converted building located somewhere in German-occupied territory, where wounded Allied airmen were held until they recovered sufficiently to be transferred to permanent prison camps. The hospital operated severely understaffed and undersupplied, struggling with overwhelming demand. German military doctors performed rapid triage assessments on all incoming prisoners. Those assessed as having survivable wounds received whatever treatment could be provided. Those deemed beyond any hope of saving were simply left alone to die as comfortably as possible. Moran's catastrophic injuries placed him firmly in the 2nd category, the hopeless cases. But this particular hospital held an unexpected secret that would change everything for Moran. Among the prisoner population were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians who had been captured on the brutal Eastern Front. They had been pressed into service treating wounded POWs, performing difficult surgeries with completely inadequate equipment and almost no anesthesia available. The Germans permitted this arrangement because it freed up their own doctors to treat more important German patients. The 2 Serbian doctors carefully examined Moran's wounds and made a critical decision together. They would attempt to save this young American's life, not because anyone had ordered them to make the attempt, not because they had access to the proper surgical tools or medications required, but simply because he was a gravely wounded human being, and they were physicians who had taken an oath. The surgery lasted a grueling 7 hours from start to finish. They worked with primitive instruments originally designed for field operations under combat conditions. They had no proper anesthesia available, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the overwhelming pain Moran experienced. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness repeatedly as they painstakingly set his severely broken bones using metal pins and wire to hold the fragments in proper alignment. They carefully cleaned away all the infected necrotic tissue from his wounds to prevent the infection from spreading further. They removed numerous bone fragments from his shattered skull and covered the exposed brain tissue with whatever healthy tissue they could salvage from the surrounding area. The Serbian doctors attached a crude metal plate to Moran's damaged head to protect the vulnerable brain tissue. The plate was crude by modern medical standards, certainly, but it proved effective enough to keep him alive through the critical period. They carefully splinted both of his mangled arms using simple wooden boards and wrapped them securely in bandages torn from old bed sheets. They did absolutely everything humanly possible with almost nothing available to work with. When the exhausting surgery was finally completed, they told Moran the honest truth about his situation. The next 72 hours would ultimately determine whether he lived or died from his injuries. His body now had to successfully fight off the remaining infection on its own. His broken bones had to begin the slow healing process. His traumatized brain had to avoid swelling any further inside his skull. There was simply nothing more the doctors could possibly do for him at this point. Eugene Moran's survival now depended entirely on his own will to live and his body's ability to heal. The fever struck hard on the first night following surgery. Moran's body temperature climbed dangerously to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. His body shook with violent chills despite the sweat absolutely pouring from his skin. The Serbian doctors monitored his condition as closely as their extremely limited resources would allow them. They changed his blood-soaked bandages regularly. They forced small amounts of water between his cracked, dry lips to prevent dehydration. Beyond that, they simply waited and hoped. Infection was the great killer in all military hospitals during this era. Antibiotics did exist by this point in the war, but they were almost impossible to obtain in any German POW medical facility. The doctors had cleaned Moran's extensive wounds as thoroughly as they possibly could, but dangerous bacteria had already entered his bloodstream before surgery. Now his immune system was fighting a desperate war inside his own ravaged body. The second night proved even worse than the first. Moran slipped into deep delirium, his mind disconnected from reality. He called out desperately for his mother back home in Wisconsin. He screamed frantic warnings to crewmates who were already dead and gone. He relived the terrifying moment when Ricky Tikitavi broke apart in midair, his unconscious mind replaying the trauma over and over in an endless loop. The other wounded prisoners recovering in the hospital ward listened to his wild ravings throughout the long night and quietly wondered among themselves whether he would actually survive to see morning. The dedicated Serbian doctors took turns sitting beside his bed throughout the night. They had no medicine to offer that could help, only their compassionate presence beside him, only cold cloths pressed gently against his burning forehead, only whispered encouragement spoken in heavily accented English that he probably couldn't even hear in his delirium. On the third morning after surgery, Moran's fever finally broke at last. He slowly opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in several days. He was still alive against all odds. The infection had not succeeded in killing him after all. His body had somehow won the desperate battle that medicine alone could not fight. The Serbian doctors examined his wounds carefully and found the first encouraging signs of actual healing beginning. The damaged tissue around his crude skull plate was gradually beginning to close and seal. The shattered bones in both arms were starting to knit back together slowly. His recovery would require months, perhaps even years of time. The damage inflicted on his body was truly extensive and severe. But Eugene Moran was definitely going to survive this ordeal. Word of his miraculous survival spread rapidly through the hospital facility. The American who fell 4 miles without any functional parachute, the tail gunner who kept shooting even as his bomber disintegrated around him, the man who should have died a dozen different times but stubbornly refused to stop breathing. German guards came by specifically to look at this remarkable American. Other prisoners requested permission to hear his incredible story firsthand. Even the normally detached hospital administrators seemed genuinely impressed by his impossible survival against such overwhelming odds. The Serbian doctors had successfully saved Moran's life through their skill and dedication, but they could not protect him forever from what came next. Once Moran was stable enough to survive travel, he would be transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp for the duration. The hospital was only a temporary way station, a place where wounded men were patched together before being sent into the broader German POW system. 6 full weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again under his own power. His arms remained immobilized in splints for proper healing. The metal plate installed in his skull caused persistent, constant headaches that plagued him. His broken ribs ached painfully with every single breath he took, but he was mobile again, conscious, and ready for transfer to a permanent camp. The Germans processed him with typical bureaucratic efficiency, recording his name, rank, serial number, service branch, and unit assignment for their detailed records. They photographed him for their official files. A thin young man with sunken, hollow cheeks and heavily bandaged arms staring directly into the camera, with eyes that had witnessed far too much for his age. His first permanent assignment was to Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a compound specifically designed and built to hold captured Allied airmen behind barbed wire fences and guard towers with machine guns in wooden barracks that offered minimal protection against the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands upon thousands of American and British airmen filled the overcrowded camp. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, men who had been shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Some had been prisoners for several years already. Others, like Moran, had arrived only weeks before. All of them now shared the exact same fate: captivity until either the war ended or they died. Moran discovered a strange sense of community existing behind the wire fences. Prisoners organized themselves into functioning military units despite their captivity. They maintained strict military discipline and order. They created improvised libraries from donated books sent by the Red Cross. They held educational classes in subjects ranging from mathematics to foreign languages for anyone interested. They built secret radio receivers to monitor BBC broadcasts about the war's progress. They constantly planned elaborate escapes that rarely, if ever, actually succeeded. The camp administration provided absolutely minimal food rations: thin, watery soup, dense black bread, and occasionally potatoes or turnips when available. Red Cross packages supplemented their inadequate diet when deliveries actually arrived, but such deliveries were highly unpredictable and unreliable. Most prisoners lost between 20 and 30 pounds during their captivity behind the wire. Some unfortunate men lost considerably more. Moran's battered body continued its slow healing process. His arms gradually regained basic function, though they would never possess the same strength as before his injuries. The persistent headaches from his skull injury became somewhat less frequent over time. However, the terrifying nightmares about the crash and fall never stopped haunting him. He was alive, certainly. He was surviving each day. But a long 17 months of captivity still stretched out ahead of him, and the very worst of his ordeal was yet to come. During the summer of 1944, the Germans transferred Moran to a different facility entirely. The journey transported him across occupied Poland in a cattle car packed impossibly tight with 60 prisoners. There was no room to sit down properly, no sanitation facilities whatsoever, and no food provided for 3 full days. Men collapsed against each other from exhaustion and prayed desperately for the train to finally stop. His destination turned out to be another camp, then yet another after that. Over the following months, Moran passed through 4 completely different POW facilities as the Germans shuffled their prisoners across their rapidly shrinking empire. Each transfer brought fresh hardships to endure, new guards to deal with, new diseases spreading through the camps, and new ways to suffer that the prisoners had never imagined. The absolute worst experience came in the autumn of 1944. The Hell Ship. German authorities made the decision to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea by ship. The vessel selected was an aging, deteriorating freighter that had never been designed to carry human cargo safely. Guards forced the prisoners down into the hold below deck, a dark metal cavern with absolutely no ventilation, no sanitation facilities, and no physical space to move around. Moran descended into that nightmarish hold along with 200 other men. The heavy hatch slammed closed above them, sealing them in. The ship's engines rumbled to life and began to move, and their nightmare began in earnest. The hold was absolutely, completely dark. Prisoners couldn't even see their own hands held inches from their faces. They could only hear the sounds surrounding them, men groaning in pain, coughing violently, retching and vomiting, men suffering from dysentery who couldn't possibly reach the single bucket designated as a latrine for 200 men. The overwhelming stench became absolutely unbearable within just a few hours. The nightmarish crossing lasted 4 full days. Prisoners actually died in that dark hold during the voyage. Their bodies remained among the living because there was simply nowhere else to place them in the cramped space. Some men went completely mad from the oppressive darkness and the overwhelming smell and the constant rolling motion of the ship in rough seas. They screamed incoherently. They fought with each other over nothing. They prayed desperately to God. Some men simply stopped responding to any stimuli and had to be checked for a pulse to determine if they were still actually alive. When the hatch finally opened after 4 days, Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had completely forgotten how to process light after so long in darkness. His clothes were absolutely soaked with filth of every kind. His body had shed even more weight that it simply couldn't afford to lose. The metal plate in his damaged skull throbbed with constant pain that never fully subsided anymore. The Hell Ship delivered its surviving human cargo to yet another camp, this one in Prussia. More barbed wire fences, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, more endless waiting for a war that seemed like it might never actually end. But the war was indeed ending, whether it seemed that way or not. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east. Allied armies were pushing hard from the west. Germany was being systematically crushed between two unstoppable military forces. The prisoners could clearly hear distant artillery fire growing louder each day. They could observe German guards growing increasingly nervous and agitated. Something significant was about to change dramatically. On February 6, 1945, that change finally arrived. Soviet troops were approaching the camp's location rapidly. German commanders issued immediate orders for a complete evacuation of all prisoners. Every prisoner would march west on foot toward an uncertain destination. The duration of the march remained unknown. Refusal to march would result in immediate execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound as ordered. Outside temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Many men possessed no winter coats, no gloves, and no proper boots to protect them. They had been surviving on starvation rations for many months already, and now they were expected to walk across Germany during the coldest winter recorded in decades. The column of marching men stretched for miles in both directions. Thousands of Allied airmen trudged through deep snow and ice. German guards marched alongside the column with loaded rifles at the ready. Anyone who fell behind the column would be shot without warning. Anyone who attempted to escape would be shot immediately. The message couldn't be clearer: walk or die. Moran had already survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. He had survived catastrophic injuries that should have killed him. He had survived crude surgery performed with inadequate tools and raging infection afterward. He had survived the hell ship crossing. Now he faced 600 miles of frozen roads stretching ahead with a body that had never fully healed from any of his previous ordeals. This forced march would later become known historically as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in all of European history. It would last 86 brutal days of walking through blizzards and freezing rain, sleeping in barns filled with animal waste, drinking from roadside ditches contaminated with human sewage, and eating whatever could be stolen or scavenged from the devastated countryside they passed through. Historians estimate that approximately 1,500 American and British airmen died during the Black March from various causes: pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that progressed to gangrene, and bullets from guards who decided that waiting for a struggling straggler simply wasn't worth their time. Eugene Moran put one foot in front of the other, step after step, and stubbornly refused to stop moving forward. Behind him lay 17 long months of brutal captivity. Ahead of him lay an uncertain number of miles through hostile enemy territory. Somewhere beyond that unknown distance, if he could just survive long enough, lay freedom, at last. The Black March ground forward relentlessly through February and March of 1945. Prisoners walked between 15 and 20 miles each day through snow that sometimes reached their knees in depth. They slept in frozen barns when they were lucky, or on open ground when they weren't. They ate raw potatoes stolen from frozen fields and drank melted snow because the streams were contaminated with waste. Moran's damaged body protested every single step he forced it to take. His arms had healed improperly and ached constantly in the bitter cold. The metal plate in his skull conducted the freezing temperatures directly into his brain tissue. His ribs had never fully recovered from the injuries sustained in the crash 17 months earlier. Every breath of frigid air reminded him painfully of the injuries he had sustained. Men died all around him daily during the march. Some simply collapsed in the snow and never got back up. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours. German guards shot prisoners who couldn't maintain the pace of the column. The marching column left a trail of frozen bodies across the German countryside like grim markers on a map of human suffering. But Moran kept walking forward, step after step. He had not survived a 4-mile fall just to die on a frozen road. He had not endured the hellship just to surrender to exhaustion now. Something deep inside him absolutely refused to quit fighting. It was the same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his machine guns as Ricky Tikitavi disintegrated around him. By April, the exhausted column had covered nearly 500 miles of ground. The prisoners could hear Allied artillery growing noticeably louder with each passing day. American and British forces were closing in from the west. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing from all sides. Liberation was finally coming. On April 26, 1945, the long march ended at last. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards immediately threw down their weapons and surrendered without resistance. The emaciated prisoners stood in stunned silence, completely unable to process what was actually happening. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed absolutely certain, they were free at last. Moran weighed just 93 pounds when he was liberated. He had entered the Army weighing 150 pounds. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, the hellship, and the march had stripped away nearly 40% of his total body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, but he was alive and free. Medical personnel rushed to treat the liberated prisoners immediately. Many required immediate hospitalization for life-threatening conditions. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant throughout the group. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would require amputation. The medical teams worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months or years. The Army processed Moran's case with growing astonishment as they reviewed his file. His service record documented events that seemed impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943, aircraft completely destroyed by enemy action. Fell 24,000 feet while trapped in a severed tail section without any functional parachute. Survived impact with the ground. Captured by enemy forces, held as a prisoner of war for 17 brutal months, and survived a forced march of approximately 600 miles. Military historians would later confirm, through careful research, that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without working parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of those 3 men. The other 2 survivors had similar stories involving wreckage riding, where pieces of their destroyed aircraft slowed their descent just enough to make survival barely possible. All 3 cases were considered absolutely miraculous by any standard. The Army awarded Moran 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he sustained during the attack on his bomber, one for each arm that was shattered by German cannon fire. They presented him with the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force. They gave him the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal for his service. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1st, 1945, officially ending his military service. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war, 206 aircraft destroyed in combat, thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets throughout Europe. Moran's survival represented a statistical anomaly in an organization that had been defined by catastrophic losses. News of his miraculous fall had spread even during the war itself. Radio operators had intercepted German broadcasts describing an American who fell 4 miles and somehow lived to tell about it. The story eventually reached Wisconsin, where Moran's family had spent agonizing months not knowing if he was alive or dead. Anonymous letters arrived from various sources describing what the radio operators had heard in the broadcasts. Hope mixed with terrible uncertainty until official confirmation finally came at last. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran returned home to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin in late 1945. The farm boy who had once dreamed of flying while watching planes pass overhead, the tail gunner who fell from the sky and stubbornly refused to die. He was just 21 years old, chronologically. Emotionally, he had aged decades. The question now was whether he could successfully build a meaningful life after everything he had endured. Eugene Moran married Margaret Finley just a few months after returning to Wisconsin. She was a local girl who had known him before he left for the war. She somehow saw past the physical scars and the hollow eyes and the nightmares that woke him screaming in the darkness most nights. She saw the man underneath all the damage and loved him anyway. Together, they built a life on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same landscape where Moran had grown up watching airplanes pass overhead and dreaming of flight. Now those innocent dreams had been permanently replaced by memories he could never fully escape. The roar of bomber engines, the chatter of machine guns, the unforgettable sound of aluminum tearing apart at 24,000 feet. Moran rarely spoke about the war to anyone, not to his wife, not to his 9 children, not to anyone who asked about his service. The experiences were simply too painful, the losses too profound to discuss openly. 8 of his crewmates had died aboard Ricky Tikitavi that day. Countless friends had perished in the camps and on the march. Talking about it meant reliving it all over again. So he chose to stay silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds inflicted by the war never fully healed completely. The metal plate in his skull caused persistent headaches for the rest of his long life. His arms remained noticeably weak and prone to pain whenever cold weather arrived. His ribs ached whenever storms approached the area. His body carried the physical evidence of November 29th, 1943, until his final breath. But Moran lived fully despite everything. He raised his family with love. He worked his farm faithfully. He attended church services on Sundays and watched his grandchildren grow. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly all of his fellow crew members from that day. The farm boy, who should have died a dozen times over instead, lived to see the 21st century arrive. In 2007, more than 6 full decades after the war ended, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. they chose Eugene Moran as the very first recipient of this prestigious award. Finally, officially, his home state recognized what he had endured and what he had survived. The award ceremony brought significant attention to his remarkable story at last. Journalists interviewed him extensively. Historians carefully documented his account for the record. A local teacher named John Armbruster became fascinated by the tale and began conducting extensive interviews with Moran and his family members. The silence of 60 years finally broke open. Armbruster spent years researching every detail he could find: military records, German archives, interviews with surviving witnesses. His research project would eventually become a book called Quote 2, published in 2022, a complete account of the farm boy who fell 4 miles and lived. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove officially honored Moran by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, and where he spent the rest of his life. The other survivor of Ricky Tikitavi also made it home eventually. Navigator Jesse Orison had successfully bailed out of the forward section before the bomber broke apart completely. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony later confirmed Moran's account and helped establish the accurate historical record of that November morning over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014, at the age of 89 years old. 7 full decades had passed since the day German flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling 4 miles towards the earth below. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the entire world spun around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with crude tools and impossible skill. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple personal philosophy: "I would rather wear out than rust out." The words of a man who absolutely refused to surrender, to the Germans, to his injuries, to the march, to the silence that followed. The tail gunner position on a B-17 was the loneliest spot on the entire aircraft. Separated from the crew, first target for attacking enemy fighters, last to know if the bomber was going down. Eugene Moran occupied that position on November 29, 1943. And when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he didn't curl up and passively wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down to earth. If this story moved you the way it moved all of us here at WW2 Combat Sky, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day, stories about tail gunners who fell from the sky, farm boys who refused to die, real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer here. You're part of keeping these important memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the war, or just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Eugene Moran doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.